We're going to be talking about the optimizing, the closing the deal, and something that's, I think, overlooked in this world where we're always looking to tweak and reduce friction and optimize processes, but sometimes we forget kind of the most important piece. So I'm basically going to have a discussion with some of these topics about some of the implementations to optimize this process fail. And then from there, kind of discuss the reasons for it and some of the options to, mitigate the issues involved. And it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. My name is Mark Lerner. I'm the Director of Growth Marketing at DealHub. DealHub is a native CPQ for CRM such as HubSpot, Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, Freshworks. And, I'm a very active member of RevOps Club, and I'm joined today by Sean Whitestone. And Sean, you can go ahead and introduce yourself before we jump into the meat of things here.
Brilliant. Really appreciate the introduction, Mark. Sean Whitestone, one of the operating partners at Venture Tech Group. Focus a lot on consulting, predominantly around go-to-market strategy, and then also the different technologies that unlock that. So Salesforce, DealHub, a number of many others, HubSpot, all of which become very relevant when we're thinking about operationalizing and driving best practices. So that's a little bit about myself and what we do as a company.
Awesome. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a second while we tee up the beginning of our discussion here. But as Sean and I were kind of meeting over the last week or two to talk about how we were going to take this discussion, Sean brought up this really, I think, impactful statistic, which is that 3/4 of all digital transformations fail. It's probably a statistic you're familiar with, but of those, 70% are due to a lack of adoption by users or the change of behavior. And I think that second piece really sets up a lot of kind of the discussion here, but I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the conversation here, Sean. That statistic is, I think, it's been around for a while. It might have been from like 2022, but I think it's still relevant today. And as we talked about it within the context of this discussion, I felt it was really really relevant. But in the terms of some of the work you do on implementations when it comes to like quote to cash, how have you seen that statistic play out? Does it ring true? Have you seen it in action? So let's set the baseline. Is it something that you see in the wild?
Absolutely. And sometimes I might go as far to say I think it might be underrepresenting the actual number of failures. And where I believe that to be the case is that in a lot of times, we've got people in RevOps. We work very closely with RevOps and we set out, okay, here's our project success criteria and business outcomes. And we do successfully achieve those. But at the end of the day, sometimes that end user is getting left behind. So I think if you actually went as far as to poll, for example, your sales reps on whether the implementation was successful in driving to whatever they were promised as part of the project, the number might even be higher. And I think oftentimes that end user is the one not being consulted, not being brought into the process to drive iterative improvements and enhancements. So I think certain cases, there might be failure rates even higher than that, to be candid. And I guess to that, Mark, I would be curious. I know we don't have formal polling, but just garnering the audience perspective with some of those stats. And if people want to chime in the chat, I'm curious what their lived experiences have been too.
Yeah, I'd love to see that as well. I think one of the things that really stuck out to me about that failure number, especially as it relates to the discussion today, is when we talk about user adoption for something like a CPQ with optimizing the coding process. You can really kind of look at it as two different types of users, right? So there's the end user that we'll call the seller, right? The person that's actually generating a quote and sending that quote and the various kind of documentations to the buyer. But the buyer is also a type of user in this scenario because they're kind of consuming the end result of what's done by the seller. And I think in our instance here, we can kind of break things down into these two different user groups, quote unquote, as part of this discussion about how you can ensure that you optimize this kind of quote to cash process that's so critical. Taking a step back, and I'd love to pose this to you as well, because over the last year or so, I've had the opportunity to interview a bunch of revenue leaders, sales, rev ops, all sorts of folks for our podcast. And one of the things that's really become obvious to me is that, it sounds silly to say because it seems so obvious, but the impact of it is not necessarily obvious. The amount of things that have changed over the last 4 or 5 years and the speed with which they've changed has been kind of unprecedented, right? We started a few years ago, the whole world shut down. Everyone kind of thought their jobs were done. And then it was kind of, especially in the SaaS world, in tech, it was somewhat the opposite. We had the kind of free money train. And then, we had really high inflation relatively quickly. And there was a whole bunch of things that happened in the wake of that. And then we're, whatever this is right now is a new thing, right? And that has caused buyers and sellers in the B2B space to have to adapt really quickly. And I think there were some organizations, just their kind of DNA might not have been built for that kind of moving quickly. And I think that's part of the reason some didn't do well and some have done well. But in your experience, have you seen that play out with some of the folks you work with, and how have they taken in, the need to be adaptive to those changes? Have they kind of run with it, brought it in as part of their process?
Yeah, I think it's forced a lot of companies to sort of reevaluate and examine their DNA. I mean, one obvious shift I think that is front of mind for everybody is with the implosion of AI and how that people feel like, hey, we're now have a place where AI could cannibalize a lot of, what we provide to the market, specifically in SaaS, right? And so as it relates to like how companies can embody that, something that we hold really core is what many people might be familiar with, which is an agile methodology, which really focuses on what are the critical elements we need as it pertains to any solution, both from a product development standpoint, but also from an implementation. And then how can we rapidly iterate so that we can respond to the environment. And I think that becomes especially crucial in a CPQ tool, Mark. If we think about things like, oh, we need to change our pricing model, or we need to update our discount matrix to be more competitive with a new entrant in the market, or we need a better renewal process. All of that needs to factor into the tooling you have that can support that ability to rapidly adapt to what's changing. And I think that becomes very relevant, both from a methodology standpoint, but then also for your tooling in systems where you can quickly go in and own those changes. It's not, hey, I got to go call a partner. We got to go do some big project that's very bloated and it's going to take 6 months to get new pricing into our system.
Right. And, I think from the perspective of CPQ, right, when it comes to adaptability and agility in the face of those kind of trends, pricing is one huge one, right? Because if you need to make pricing changes in the face of, changing economics, and it takes 6 to 8 months to completely re-implement something that you've already put in, by the time that 6 months comes, the market will have changed again, at least in this environment, and you'll have to do it all over again. It's kind of a non-starter. You can't work that way. And so I love that you brought up the kind of agile methodology here, because I think that is one of the pieces that really is critical. Another change I think that we've been seeing for quite a while, in my opinion, is the decision-making process of buyers within the B2B space, right? I know we've talked about this offline, but I don't think I brought up the fact that I do think that the Amazonification of consumer buying habits has had a deep impact on B2B buyers as well. But from your perspective, when it comes to the decision-making process of those buyers, of buyers in general in our space, what are the factors that go into their decision-making processes?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest trends we've started to note, and a lot of our clients have spoken to as well when they're making decisions around procurement of technology, is like a multifaceted and diverse stakeholder group, right? Historically, sometimes RevOps would just have autonomy to go buy a tool that they knew there was a business need for. And I think now one, there's a lot more scrutiny on anything that's being asked because companies are focused on the bottom line, they're focused on OpEx. And two, the diversity in who you're bringing in to evaluate that tool becomes very important because it sets the stage for the implementation of it, such that okay, for a CPQ solution, we need representation from sales, from operations, from customer success, from finance, because they're all going to have key inputs in what the right solution is going to be for us versus let's go buy a tool, which we see time and time again. Sales goes to buy a tool, finance goes to buy a tool. They forget to consult those other departments that have dependencies on it. And halfway through the project, they go, oops, maybe this wasn't the most scalable solution or what we needed for the job. So I think that's a huge factor, is the number of stakeholders involved. I think the other big consideration, which is a very obvious one, is cost, but I break that into two categories, right? You've got your OpEx, which is your ongoing licensing cost, and then you've got your CapEx, which is going to be that one-time fee, which to me kind of create your total cost of ownership. And I think it's vital to think about that, not just for the initial implementation, but for your maintenance afterwards, right? Is this a tool that a RevOps individual can kind of own and administer internally, or have someone that they delegate to own that? Or is there going to be a dependency on a third-party system integrator to upkeep that tool? And anytime you need to make a change, you've got to call a developer, right? Those are really critical when you're thinking about projecting out, a 3-year model of costs with any type of solution.
Yeah, and Chris made a point here in the chat based on your original question. He said 100% of these projects miss key needs or integrations to other systems, therefore scope creep cause delays. Mm-hmm. Once added, department advocates have seen department advocates have seen drastic improvements. And so I think, that point you made about, the committee involved, all the stakeholders involved, being a diverse group of stakeholders is critical. And that impacts the end result that we talked about, which is adoption by, I guess in this moment, we're talking about the internal user, right? The sales rep that's going to be using this new solution that you implement. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the things that drive your internal users' adoption of something like a CPQ tool, something that's involved in the optimizing the closing process. We have obviously said that lack of adoption is 70% of the reason that these projects fail. So what strategies have you seen work well to drive user adoption when implementing a solution? And how were the kind of successful projects thought of from the get-go to ensure that user adoption was in the front of your mind?
What I would coach everybody on, and something we really stress with any of our delivery teams when they take on a project, is adhering to that agile methodology, which results in what's a minimum viable product. Said another way, what are the core need to haves versus what's a nice to have? And oftentimes when you really press them and have that discussion to get them to think critically, there's a lot of items that move into that nice to have bucket of, oh, you know what, we can get by with a manual process until we tackle that. And that does a number of things for the success of the project. One, it really creates this crawl, walk, run. Two, it delivers time to value for the business. So it's an accelerant on, we've spent X amount on licensing. Now we're actually begin to see the returns. And three, it starts to unlock things you weren't even aware of at the outset of the project of new requirements that come up. And I think when a lot of people see the tooling in action, especially departments, they go, oh, light bulb moment, I could use it for this, or here's another application of it. And that can really help them get bought in that they're part of building this solution, inclusive of your sales rep. So I would really caution people not to be too aspirational at the outset. There's no better way to lose momentum than having a 6 to 12 month implementation where everyone's sitting around waiting. And to our earlier point, the business pivots 3 more times along the way. So the requirements you gathered at the outset using a traditional model of waterfall are no longer relevant. So a lot in there, but I'd say really focus on what are the critical pressing priorities we need to solve for. Let's hit those first. And then we can move on to some of the other items we've uncovered in the backlog as we continue to grow with the product.
Yeah. And I think I think that it's true that beyond user adoption, that there's kind of those upstream effects that would, make it more difficult for user adoption to happen, especially if you have top-down kind of decision making about tooling, processes, um, you know, how you should go through the sales process to, generate a quote, how you should present that to the sales rep, that is not kind of natural to the sales rep themselves. And therefore they're going to want to bypass it because, when you're actually have to do it day to day, someone who's not in it may have ideas about what's optimal, but in practice it's not. And that's how you get shelfware, right? So you implement something, you have a whole project, but you didn't take into account the end user and their needs and kind of idiosyncrasies there, and then they never use it, and you're back to square one after 9 months, right?
And I'll tell you something to that end, Mark, we see a lot of. Oftentimes, there's a huge disconnect between what leaders at the top of an organized think the process is and what the reality of that process is when you actually speak to the end users. And not having their involvement at the outset can lead to builds that are somewhat, again, aspirational. However, you get to UAT testing and one of the sales reps or somebody else pipes up and goes, well, that's not how you do it, how we do it here. And you've made a huge assumption that involves now going back and doing all this rework because they weren't consulted early enough in the process. So I think that's a huge factor. And part of that too, there's a quote I always go back to by Charlie Munger, which is, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And so I think you need to keep that core throughout the entire project. You alluded to different sets of internal stakeholders earlier, like we've got our users and we've got our buyers. I would actually expand upon that because you're calling out the sales rep, but I would say, especially as it relates to like a CPQ implementation, you've got the sales reps, you've got operations, revenue operations that wants good data so they can make data-driven decisions. You've got finance, who's typically involved in payment terms, discount matrices, approving margin on deals. And then you've also got customer success. So I think it's a gross oversimplification to say we just have sellers. Now they all help in the selling process, but they're intimately involved in that whole customer lifecycle journey, and understanding all of their incentives will help you build to a better outcome when you take any project on.
Yeah, I love a good Charlie Munger quote. He's one of he really has a bunch of them. Warren Buffett as well. There's always so many great ones. But I'm really interested to dive a little bit deeper into kind of behavior and what motivates that behavior, and how as somebody who's focused on really optimizing this closing process, right? The quote to close process, how you can think about behavior as a way to encourage a change in that behavior for your end users. So, I know that you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah.
I hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to make this as concrete as possible, but I think it kind of requires drawing a little bit on economics. And historically, they always thought of this rational choice theory, which essentially posit like any individual economic actor is going to seek to maximize utility, is going to deal in complete information, and they're going to optimize for the best decision. So economics was built upon that for a long time. And it wasn't until Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky came around, famous Israelis, and basically did studies to prove that even though we think we're completely rational, the fact of the matter is we're predictably irrational, and we're unaware of all these unconscious biases that are actually driving our decision. There's a great metaphor of like the rider and the elephant, which they use to explain the dichotomy. The rider is that rational brain we have that's logical and thinks through everything. And the elephant is that emotional, responsive fight or flight. As this relates to users and what you guys deal with, I think we oftentimes build for the rider. We build for that system one of, oh, perfect, rational sales rep. They understand why we need a closed loss reason in a deal. They're going to put that reason in accurately because they want to give us good data so we can figure out how to change our pricing. But then there's the irrational user, which we know is most of our sales reps, which is stressed at the end of month, end of quarter, missing quota, and not wanting to fill in this information, and they're pissed because they just lost the deal. So I think the more you can factor in that we're dealing with a lot of different biases with these individuals, they're not perfectly rational users, lets you kind of unlock how to design these systems to make them more impactful. And we can go through very specific examples of that. One is like the paradox of choice, right? If we give people and present people with too many options, it ends up being paralyzing and it doesn't promote a decision. I call this like the Netflix problem, right? Where you sit there, you scroll through 50 shows or movies, you don't end up watching a single one. Well, the same thing applies for our customers, right? If we're presenting 4 options related to pricing on a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 year, adding this bundle, removing this SKU, adding this level of support, it can be paralyzing. So how do we design systems that ask the right questions early on of the sales rep to position the right solution? Something that comes to mind, you guys do really well, Mark, is that guided selling, right? Like we're nudging them through a series of question and answer to like, what's going to be optimal to close your deal? And I think that can be really powerful. So thinking about devices and ways to tap into our biases in the build and design becomes critical in any project.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating talking about that. Giving too many choices is being kind of a factor of inhibiting people's decision making, right? If you look at the difference between something like an iPhone and an Android, right? With an Android, there's much more customization. There's a lot more you can do, but it's almost too much. Whereas iPhone has been very kind of, this is how you do it. And, you can see that those are like kind of the dueling products there and the dueling philosophies. But yeah, I think that, you were initially talking about how that problem is affecting, the buyer, if you give them too many choices. But you tied it back, I think very well to the seller, as they're kind of creating the quote for a buyer, ensuring those guardrails are in place, that pathway that they can go through is not too open, because then it leaves it open for choice making that may be incorrect or errors, but not too limited because it may not go with their preferred process. So I think, kind of piggybacking on this, when we're talking about quoting and streamlining quotes, I think the kind of phrase, we want to streamline our quoting process, right? What does that mean? We talk about, I think there's 2 aspects to it, right? There's fast and there's accurate, right? So, what do you think are some of the ways in which you can solve for those 2 really critical pieces in order to focus on streamlining the quoting process?
So when you think about streamlining the quoting process, let me maybe ask a question in response to that. Are you thinking about like the acceleration of how long it takes to produce a quote, or are you thinking about the entire deal life cycle of from when I produce the quote through until when I close the deal with my customer, and making that as expedient as possible? Maybe just kind of clarifying that would be helpful as I work through the answer.
It's a good question. I think initially I was focused on this piece, but I think it's related to the entire process, right? Because the longer and more friction in the entire selling process, the more likely you are to lose the deal, right? A competitor swoops in, they get cold feet, whatever, right? You want the speed to close is a critical metric here. So I think I'm, specifically talking about the quoting process, and there are issues where it takes a long time to get approvals for the pricing, or you have an incorrect quote, or there's an error on something. Mitigating those factors and getting the right quote to the right person at the right time with the right approvals, optimizing that process.
Yeah, I think of it in a couple of ways. I mean, I think the first is your tool needs to be a forcing function to get people working off a single source of truth, right? Because there's a variety, like we've hit on consistently throughout this, there's a variety of people typically involved in a quote. Now, that's not every quote. If it's an add-on or something, and I'm going to speak mostly for SaaS because I think that's the bulk of our audience here. If there's an add-on, right, what do we need the rep to do? We need them to be able to quickly pull in the contracted pricing or existing contract rates. I think nothing frustrates a rep more than when they feel like their deal is standing to be jeopardized because they can't get back to a customer fast enough with an answer. And I think core to any, implementation of a tool is do no harm, and that principle, right? We need to, at a minimum, make things a lateral move, if not significantly improve. So keeping that core throughout any project, I think is vital. So one, it becomes a way to collaborate, right? I need approvals from finance on discounting. I need involvement from ops because, we're going to prorate the start date. And having that becomes critical in accelerating that process because it's important, right? This is the lifeline of your business. This is how you're paying for product development. It's how you're paying for people's salaries. So the ability to make it a tool around collaboration, I think, is critical, number one. And number two, giving access to information so that you can make the right decision. I think too often times we hear stories, Mark, that a sales rep built a pricing model or built their discounting in Excel. Everyone's done it, admit it. And they put pricing in front of a customer that can't actually get approved. Well, now you're running into a situation where that is business stopping and impacting because you can't offer those rates. They've been promised to a customer incorrectly, and now you got to walk that back. Like that creates way more friction for your buyers, right? Maybe they took that internally and said, yep, we can move forward with this. So thinking about some of those elements, I think, is really where you can streamline that close process, which involves so many different folks.
Yeah, I mean, and I think adding some on top of that, the idea of sales rep going rogue and sending out quotes from their own kind of bespoke Excel spreadsheet, I think is every RevOps person's nightmare. At least that I've spoken to. It's what keeps them up at night, as someone at a previous role I was at said. But it's like every step in the process, right? So obviously we don't want that to happen, right? But even if it's a centralized tool that is, has got certain bells and whistles, you also want to ensure that what is discussed between the rep and the buyer is then reflected in what's offered to the seller, because you send it over, they get it over a weekend, it takes a few days, and then they realize, hey, this is not what we talked about, right? This is a different thing. And so it's like really about ensuring that, the products and pricing, discounting, terms, all of those things are reflective of what was discussed in the conversation. I think that goes back to this idea, this concept of guided selling, which is kind of laying out a decision tree for the sales rep that then, as that decision tree is being built, that then feeds what is in the end quote, so that after a back and forth discussion with the buyer, going through a set of questions and in the discussion, there is a quote that is generated that is reflective of what's been talked about, right? Because it's really critical. Every moment counts. So
I would agree with that. I think another piece too, Mark, which we're hearing a lot about and kind of relates to the earlier point regarding how decisions are getting made through the procurement and buying process, is very often we hear from sales reps, they're having to identify a champion, and then they may not be getting access to the rest of the buying committee. And so if you're only giving them a quote that has the product name, the price, the discount, the ARR, the total contract value, I think sometimes you lose out on really creating the value prop and arming your champion to have those conversations internally. And so what we're seeing a lot of people pivot to is, I don't want to call it a quote in so much as like a true proposal, right? Where they're integrating case studies, they're integrating videos that provide demos of the solution. They're arming their champions to be true advocates to help them sell this internally, because I think oftentimes those people can be gatekeepers, and they're not giving you that access. So it really is about empowering those people to kind of sell whatever it is you're bringing into the fold through multimedia assets, different things. I know you guys have Deal Room that does this really effectively, and we've seen some compelling solutions, and it gives you analytics too. But I think doing that changes the buyer's experience as well. It's not just, okay, give me the quote, I'll sign it, I'll get you the PO. It becomes this mechanism to engage in further market throughout the cycle.
And I think that's a perfect transition into the, our other user in this scenario, right? The user adoption and behavior change for the buyer here, right? So you're actually creating a user experience for that buyer, but by the proposal that you're providing to them, both that you want to ensure it's correct and, error-free, but also in the way it's packaged, right? You want to, and like you said, give them the assets they need to be your internal champion. And you said correctly, from our perspective, we have a product called Deal Room, which does this, but I think broadly this is called like a digital sales room. And I think we've seen kind of proliferation of this out there. But I think it was once a nice to have, and now it's a need to have, because there's now, again, an expectation in the market for a better buying experience. And you have to step up your game. There are more stakeholders involved in the decision-making process, and every leg up you can get in that process is something you want to optimize for. You want to put the right assets in front of the right people with the right offer. And that's critical in order to get the buy-in from, our second user in this scenario, which is kind of the buyer. I kind of want to take a step back here and maybe talk a little bit about some of the work you've done with clients on implementations. Maybe, obviously keeping things anonymous or whatever, but maybe some scenarios in which things went south and there wasn't this kind of successful adoption, and like what you would have done, knowing what you know now, kind of Monday morning quarterbacking,
For sure.
how to, mitigate that from happening.
Great question. And I love you've asked this, because I think way more is learned from mistakes and failures than successes, because then you can wrongly attribute why you were successful. I think a number of things, and many of which we've touched on. One is trying to bite off more than you can chew, and that the business is ready for, right? With any type of new technology, there's a huge element of change management. And the more change you try to induce in any implementation, the more resistance that you're going to meet. And so thinking really critically about, okay, what are the things we absolutely need, and focusing on those, and focusing on speaking to the value of those. Like a great example, Mark, to me is, as you alluded to with like your deal room, if you can tell a sales rep, hey, we're uprooting your whole quoting process because it's going to give you A, B, C, D, and you're going to get better analytics on a customer interacting with your proposal, then if they're stalling out, if you might need to call. Like, as a sales rep, that is more incentive in the world than I ever need of, I'm going to earn more commission after we implement this tool because I'm going to have a higher probability of closing my deals. So that's a big one, is not crystallizing the why early enough and keeping it within something that's achievable in a quick timeline. Big. Number two, I think oftentimes a single siloed department goes and says, I'm going to go buy a tool for what I need, without understanding the entire enterprise architecture, and where, one, there might be duplicative solutions that you already have access to, or two, where you don't consult other groups that have dependencies on that system. That's a big one. And I think the third is probably being a little bit too rigid in not thinking about how you can improve some processes now that you have a technology to do it. Some of the failures we've encountered is where, we've always done it this way, we're always going to do it this way, versus, and I think ego gets involved, versus trying to isolate the person from the problem and objectively focusing on what is the best solution for the business, which kind of dovetails into, departments. And I think this gets back to our earlier conversation about rational, irrational. When the ego gets into play and we're not focusing on the problem and the right solution, people quickly go, this is how we do it, or this is I own this, versus really thinking about who are we as a company and what are we trying to get done. And let's look past this and focus on what's going to be best for us as a collective and as the company. So a lot of lessons learned. RACI charts, I think, are critical for any project, really thinking about who's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, identifying that early, figuring out where there are gaps. aligning on, okay, what are the project success criteria and business outcomes early, and then just being open to adapting. Things change really fast, and what might be a truth 1 month, 4 months later might be different. So not relying too heavily on just one course of action, but being, iterative in how you approach it, I think really drives to success throughout these. And those battle wounds and lessons learned stick, that's for sure. I could probably spend another hour on that, but it's really how we've built that into our methodology to try to rectify and solve against some of those things.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of something I remember from business school, and I may be butchering the name, but something that was like the hubris of success, which is, you reach a certain point and there is this, this ego that says, well, this is always the way we done it. Why would we even think about it? Kind of the quintessential case of this was Toys R Us refused to even consider e-commerce. It's, why would, or no, or Kodak, or this digital camera thing's never going to catch on, whatever. You can never, and I think we're in a moment now, actually, which is interesting because there's so much uncertainty. There's so much, kind of back and forth. Things are getting shaken up, and I think things that were taken as assumptions, base assumptions, are now no longer that. And what I mean is that an example is a very large company, looking to cut costs and optimize. It was a discussion I had with someone recently, decided to end their contract with kind of the incumbent CRM that everybody knows, and choose, more of a, let's say, an upstart CRM that I think a few years ago, a company of this size never would have considered. But we're in a moment that allows for kind of putting aside those, those assumptions. And I think that's a good transition into, well, actually, we have a question here, so I want to make sure we get to it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so Kristen says, what about when you are now forcing a deal desk function where AEs have previously never truly forced to use it for the past 7 years because our proposal grid was based on Google Sheets?
Great question. I guess I would answer it with another question, Kristen, which is
Everybody's favorite
to unpack your why, right? And if I could make a few bold assumptions, I don't know if you can go off mute with the settings we have or not, so maybe you can chat while I'm talking through this. If I were to make a bold assumption on the why, it's that AEs may not be selling profitable deals, or there aren't the right sort of discount guardrails in place such that you guys believe it's impacting ARR. I'm making a lot of bold assumptions as I'm answering this, but I think it's important to clarify the why, because then that lets you kind of communicate what you're implementing and the reasons for it. But I don't know how engaging we can make this.
Yeah, I'm not sure we can use it, but I think that, yeah, I mean, I totally get the, not wanting to introduce a new aspect of a job after, a long time of like, this is what you were hired to do. This is the process, and now we need to change, right? It's like, you have that whole change management challenge. But I think, the idea, it's just never been forced. It's an outdoor advertising and it's been free for all. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously there's the cost of opportunity, there's the cost of not doing it. And, if it's a free for all, I would imagine things go sideways a lot in terms of people saying, it's like the Wild West, as I've heard. Just because you're implementing guardrails, it doesn't mean that it has to be a burden of extra work. In reality, I think that it can be done in a way where it's actually less work, especially if you think about it from kind of the guided sales model that we were talking about, where it's really just a series of questions they have to run through rather than, have to do functions in Excel or anything like that. So, I think, and we're in a moment now where companies are focused on optimization and cost savings. And, if I'm not a CEO, but it's just like, if you can't get on board, then, this is how it's going to be. I know that's rough, but
the carrot and then there's the stick. Yeah. I guess you got both. And I think you do, to your point, Mark, have to deploy both intelligently. The other piece I guess I would just add is, thinking about from the lens of the sales rep, to me, it's like, well, conceivably they get a percentage. I know we're making some big assumptions here, but their commission derives from the total value of the deal. And so if you can model that this is going to increase their deal size by virtue of, you know, increasing the amount they're selling to customers, then that gives them an opportunity for more commission. Now they may come back and argue, well, it could jeopardize my deal. It's going to make us too expensive. And I'd push back and say, well, then you have a problem of selling the value and selling your differentiators around why they should go with you versus a competitor. So that's kind of how I'd address it. And to me, that speaks to an enablement issue, potentially for the CRO to get involved with in addressing. Now, I made some big assumptions there, but that's just how I would think about solving a problem like that.
Yeah, I mean, I reflect back to an early part of my career, not that long ago, at a company in the tech space where they didn't, they had purchased a CRM and none of the sales reps would use it, just wouldn't use it. Why would we change broke? It ain't broke, right? They were working out of their own internal documents or whatever. And to me, as someone who, these were people that had been at this company for a long, long time, and they had their way of doing things. To me, coming in new, this seemed totally insane that this would be, something that would even be under discussion. And, I think change management is, like you said, with the carrot and the stick, but if you don't have both, then you may not get the outcome.
They're tools, right? They're tools in the toolbox. And I think you need to figure out when you need to use the right tool for each job. I know there's a bunch of questions. So if we want to pivot to answering those, I'm happy to do that as well, Mark.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is great. I love the questions. And the first question here from Chris was sort of along the lines of what I was talking, transitioning to, which is, CRM, data integrity with the CRM. So how do you handle data integrity with the CRM improvements? We added MDQ and it killed all existing data.
Gosh, I got to stop answering these with more questions, but usually one snippet is hard to go off of alone. MDQ to me sounds like Salesforce CPQ, which has a completely different data model. They use data for their records versus metadata. I would basically just answer that by saying, make sure you're doing everything in a full copy sandbox. And that applies to anything. Always, always, always. We have a running joke, don't build in production. It's true, because then you hit some tripwire and everything explodes. So test, make sure you get involvement from those users before you push anything into prod. Don't build into prod. I think that's a critical piece of the data integrity question. There's probably a lot more we can unpack there. And I guess as it relates to these two teams, if you want to set up time afterwards, I'm in the RevOps channel. I think Camilla and team Mark will share information. So happy to set up some separate times to go through those as well. I don't know if that completely answered the question. It looks like it was close. I don't know if you want to keep running through these. I think there's some answers here, which I love too. People collaborating together.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun, guys. I think just speaking to that same concept, data integrity is, to me, I think the critical piece for RevOps in general, right? Making sure that the data from the start of the sale all the way through to billing, revenue recognition. I mean, if there's an error in the data integrity somewhere along the line, it's not, the sales rep necessarily or the sales team necessarily that's going to be impacted. You're talking about forecasting finance, you're talking about income and taxes and revenue and raising of funds, and it has all sorts of downstream impacts, which are a huge risk if you get things wrong. And that's why it's such a critical piece. And I think that from our perspective, from DealHub's perspective, data integrity is kind of a singularly critical piece to the whole process. So, yeah, so I think in general, as we, I guess, are coming towards the end here, I do think this idea of the CRM, its data, and the integration with rest of the tools in the quote to cash process, where, how important is it? Obviously, it's important, but what is the data that is most critical to ensure that is connected?
Sorry, that was a question for me specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, it's typically going to live in two systems, right? You're going to have it in your CRM, so that could be HubSpot, could be Salesforce, could be Dynamics. I shouldn't limited, but those are kind of the three big players, especially in the Gartner quadrant. There's some smaller niche players as well, but holistically from a category standpoint, it's going to be in your CRM. And then the other one's probably your ERP, right? That's where you're going to handle a lot of the billing, invoicing of customers. You could potentially have contracts in there, like Intex contracts module or NetSuite's contracts equivalent. I know they use a number of different solutions there, but having those tied together, kind of hub spoke, becomes critical for any quoting solution. And I think something that obviously needs to be part of any type of evaluation you're doing. Tipton, I know you had made one comment earlier regarding the capacity of sales reps and sort of the administrative burden. And I don't disagree whatsoever, right? The last thing they want is, and I would actually make the argument, I think a lot of them feel like a CRM's like Big Brother, George Orwell, 1984, like, I'm always watching you. What are you doing? Managing your activity. Have you made calls, major meetings, versus turning it into something they truly believe is an asset that's helping them be more productive or sell more. Where I'd push back on, though, is that I think you can, if designed correctly and intelligently, use a lot of automation to reduce that administrative burden, i.e., I've just closed a deal. I've got a signed quote. Now I've got to send this over to finance in an email and attach the PDF so that they can enter the contract into NetSuite or Intact or Maxio or whatever billing system you use, right? Like, that's where automation can reduce a lot of that burden and prevent all the back and forth from manual processes. That's not to discredit your point, but I think, if designed intelligently within the right systems, automation can be a huge enabler to giving them time back in their days, which is probably a whole separate podcast, or webinar, I should say.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that, we talk about, I don't think it's kind of binary that adding something like this is then increasing the administrative burden. You have to think about the burden of the status quo and what that, how many points of failure are currently in place that may or may not already be failing and require, redundant work. I think. Yeah.
I was just going to say, the last thing I'll say, somewhat tongue in cheek, is, sales reps are always going to complain, if I've learned one thing. And I was a sales rep at some point too. And so I can appreciate that and stand for that too. But I think, we need to be cognizant as well that, hey, what's in it for me? As Camilla very astutely pointed out, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, put yourself in their shoes, understand that. But also at the end of the day, you're paying them a pretty significant hefty salary to perform a role. There's some things they're going to have to do and be bought into for the greater good, for lack of a better term. And I think that orientation from me to we becomes really critical too for these types of implementations.
Yeah. And I would say that, as we round things down here, that even if there's a kind of Frankenstein process in place today that is not destroying business, but is kind of, made to tied together with like bubble gum and shoestring, that it being not falling apart is, not guaranteed to continue. And, it needs to be planned for today, what's going to happen tomorrow, because if it does fail and things go catastrophic, taking the time to find a new solution and implement it, you may not have enough time. And so I think it's always important to not assume that what works today is going to work tomorrow, especially in the moment we're in now, where things change so quickly. There's so, black swan events that are, abound. And I can think of 5 potential black swan events that could, change everything. And so, we always have to have a plan for what happens next and be prepared. So that, I think, is, the way, I want people to walk away thinking, from this conversation. But Sean, is there kind of a final sentiment about, how to think about, optimizing the closing process from these two perspectives that you want to leave the attendees here with?
If it was a singular statement to be as succinct as possible, it would be walk a mile in their shoes, right? walk a mile in the shoes of your users, walk a mile in the shoes of your buyers, put yourself into their lived experience. And I think that's really encapsulated with what Camilla had mentioned earlier too, like what's in it for me. That's going to drive to the best outcomes. But I think that oftentimes we're very myopic in just focusing because we're stressed and we have a million things going on of, okay, this is what I got to do to get my job done. They'll just learn, they'll figure it out. Like they need to know this is part of it. And so being able to do so, I think creates one, a lot of empathy and ability to understand what they're going through and then design things that are truly impactful.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, letting them know that this is because it's benefit to them, right? Like, you know, that doing this process is actually going to benefit you. You're going to make more money, what every salesperson wants. You're going to, in the end, have to do less busy work. Those are all kind of important things. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate y'all sticking around with us here. This has been really fantastic conversation. Sean, thank you so much for joining me here. And thank you to the RevOps co-op community. And looking forward to seeing you all at the next event.